So when we started Kraftshala, we actually started with training some of the elite institution students. But as we expanded, we quickly figured out job is what people are looking for. Job is what you have to prepare for, and jobs is what you have to win for.
Hi, this is Michael Waits, and welcome back to India Game Changer. We are joined today by Varun Satia, the founder and CEO of Kraftshala. I got most of that right. I stuttered a little bit, but that's okay. Varun, it's great to have you on the show. Let's give our listeners a little bit of your background for some context, please.
All right. Thank you very much, Michael, for inviting me. I run a company called Kraftshala, which is a marketing and sales learning platform. We're essentially a higher education platform. And I started this a few years ago. Before that, I used to work in a company called Nestle, essentially running marketing for a couple of brands like KitKat and Maggie. And before that, I had a very sort of conventional MBA and engineering background. So that's a little bit about me.
What was it like going from working at Nestle, a huge kind of global multinational corporation with just a plethora of products, to saying, yeah, I think I'd rather do this by myself?
So to answer that, actually, I'll have to go a little bit back. I kind of knew I was going to start up fairly young, to the extent that I actually started the entrepreneurship cell in my engineering college, and I led that team for a couple of years. And in fact, I got involved with a startup while I was still in college, and there were a couple of guys who had recently graduated from Harvard who had started this entrepreneurship network for campus students.
Yep.
And in fact, one of those names is fairly familiar to people right now, which is Vivek Ramaswamy, who was a presidential candidate in the Republican primary. So he was my first boss. While I was in college, I was reporting to him and I was leading the India business there. And that venture got sold off as I was sort of graduating college, and I went and did an MBA. And the logic was that you go to an engineering school to learn engineering. So that means you must be going to a business school to learn business. Turns out it doesn't work like
That
that.
way, okay.
Because I found this, I mean, obviously I sort of figured this out on campus, but I found that the B school is not degree you go to learn business. It's largely a talent pool for large organizations, right? So if I go back into the history of MBAs, like companies like Ford and later McKinsey would use it largely as a talent pool of people who can work hard, are reasonably smart, ambitious, and you can sort of show a career timeline to them. So that's what's gotten replicated in India as well. So the moment I reached B school, I kind of knew, oh, there is some turn I've taken here, which I didn't kind of anticipate, but it's still, it was a good turn in the sense that you would get access to companies like Nestle. So when I went to work for Nestle, I kind of knew that, okay, I'm going to be here for a few years and then I'm going to ship out. I didn't know when that was going to happen in. But I looked at my Nestle experience from day one to be something of a learning experience to see how large organizations operate. And there are lots of pluses and minuses that are there, but nothing really sort of compares to what a typical startup looks like. I spent about 50 crores in, Maggie is a large brand in India. It's the biggest food brand. Maggie noodles is the biggest brand. So to that extent, you would spend like 50 crore rupees on a campaign and you'd not really learn a lot about marketing. When I joined, I started my own startup, you spend like $2 and you realize, oh, this is working and it's not working, right? So to that extent, like the learning that you get obviously on the small setup is radically different. But yeah, I mean, as soon as I saw the opportunity, I just sort of quit and I started up.
What was it like working for Vivek?
Vivek was super smart and he was very articulate. So we would largely communicate on emails. This was back in 2008. So Vivek and Travis were the two co-founders who were there. Travis himself has sort of started some impressive companies since then. And I found both of them, but particularly Vivek, very articulate, very smart in a way that I'd not experienced at all in my own network. I found that he was a very inspirational leader. The first time we launched the network in India, it was an absolute failure. And they basically let me do my thing. So it was just me, my ideas, my everything. So when nothing happened out of that first launch, for 2 days, I couldn't get the courage to sort of update these guys. And eventually Vivek followed up, like in terms of how things are going in. And I wrote to him as best as I could in terms of that. But even in a written form, I think my disappointment was sort of stemming out. And he kind of figured that this is sort of quite problematic. Remember him writing a very sort of a detailed and empathetic note in terms of explaining how they'd sort of gone about it and how these were part of the pieces. I learned a lot in that period, and he was very kind even afterwards, wrote a letter of recommendation and all, which helped in my college B school essays and so on and so forth.
I want to go back to B school and this comment that you made about you kind of use Nestle as a way to learn how big companies operate, but in the back of your mind, you always thought you were going to be an entrepreneur. Firstly, like all of my friends, even in my generation, and I'm probably 25 years older than you, all of my friends told me that went to get their MBAs were like, we didn't really learn much, but the connectivity that we had and the networking that we did over those 2 years basically changed our lives in the way we were able to find jobs and find employment and find connectivity, right? So that makes sense to me. But what was it like? I never, even as a kid, thought I was going to have my own business. Never. It never entered into my mind. And I guess like the environment in which you were growing up was different. But what was kind of the impetus, even before you started your own thing, where you said, I know I'm just going to go through this process? I always ask, like, you find like a bunch of kids whose parents are doctors end up being doctors, right? Because it was always there and it just seemed like that was the profession to get into. What was it for you?
Yeah, I think that so my father's a doctor and my elder sister is a doctor. So to
See?
that extent, I can relate to that. And as a child, and my mother's a teacher, by the way, and obviously she worked in the education department later on, but started out as a teacher. And as a child, when people would ask me what I would do, I would be very clear that I'd never become a doctor or a teacher, not realizing how problematic that might sound to my parents, but it always evoked a laughter. So I kind of ran with it for a few years. I think that, I mean, if I can share sort of an anecdote here, my family essentially came to Delhi, which is where I live, at the time of partition. So they used to stay in an area which is now called Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. And when the partition happens, they sort of migrate to Delhi. They get allotted a piece of land, and that's where my grandfather builds a house,
Got it.
has a job. And then he passes away when my father is in high school. He's just about to finish high school. And my father is the eldest of four children. So as he passes away, there's a lot of pressure on my grandmother that my father should be asked to start running a shop because there's no income really left. It's just a little bit of rent that comes in because of the house, and one floors had been given up for rent. So that's about it, right?
Right.
And my grandmother said, no, no, he's smart. He should be given an opportunity to sort of run. And so my father goes into medical school, very good medical school, but he never forgets how close he came to having a very different lifestyle.
Yeah.
In fact, his brother did that for in his entire ran a shop, right? He graduates from medical school, goes into a government agency which runs clinics in India, gets a job there. He must have been earning the bottom 10 percentile money of his class because it was a very good medical school. A lot of his, at that moment of time, a lot of doctors actually emigrated to the US because the US was in the 70s, and in that period was actually sort of really importing a lot of medical talent to come in as well.
Yep.
So he earns much lesser than his class. And it doesn't seem to bother him for a second. He spends 35 years working for that same government agency, retires as happy as any other person. And that's his life, right? Because he saw how close he came to chaos.
Yeah.
And how much he valued that stability. I would never see it. So I grew up in a household where, both parents work for the government, very middle class, very sorted, even on vacations will be very frugal, don't have the smallest car, very, very functional sort of relationship with money, right? And so to that extent, I think that I wanted chaos. I found my life to be absolutely devoid of any kind of instability. And the moment I sort of discovered that you could do interesting projects that you could basically waste hours and hours on that people hadn't thought of before, that nobody kind of knew what you were doing, but you still were sort of piling in the nights. I found that in college, and I just sort of never sort of looked back. So I found the whole large company experience to be quite unnatural because
Yeah.
there was always too many layers of accountability. If I messed up, there would were five people above my pay grade who would also sort of have a role. So that basically meant that there was never any sort of a risk or reward that was there.
Right.
And I saw people who were 15 years my senior doing the same kind of work I was doing. It sort of reinforced that that is not going to be my path. And so that is why, like I said, it was very clear that to me that I'd go for something a little bit more exciting.
I love it. I love this idea of I wanted chaos. I grew up very differently. In some ways, we were probably poorer than you are. And I know that's hard to believe. And my goal was just to figure out how not to be poor, which led me directly to Wall Street and selling my soul to the devil for money for like 15 or 20 years. And you're right. And I say this very often and very publicly. It was the most unfulfilling thing I've ever done in my whole life. So good for you for realizing that early on, going for the chaos. and learning as much as you possibly could before you made your own chaos, and then building your own company. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to add in there that, money is like oxygen.
Yeah.
If you have enough of it, then you never really think about it.
Yep.
But if your income does not match your expenses and you don't have any savings, substantial savings to go back on, that's all you think about, right?
Yeah.
And that's kind of also driven our thought process in Kraftshala, right? So I'm here talking about how much I sort of like startups and my own experience and so on and so
Yep.
forth. You look at India, right? I mean, we're a fairly sort of we're growing as an economy, but even today, our per capita GDP is about $2,500. It's a very poor country. And most young people who work are actually working in their own shops, in the farms, they're running their own show. So it's a very different life. For them, a job is actually a step up, right?
Yep.
And to that extent, because money is what drives a certain level of openness, it's, most people don't understand that in India, the primary job in a country like India, the primary job of an educational institution, of an higher education institution, is to help land a reasonable job for someone. If an education institution is not delivering that, then it kind of doesn't matter what else they do. People talk about, these idealized versions of college where we're going to be exposed to ideas about
Ideas.
that are contrarian to ours, that we'll be asked to impact the world, that our aspirations are going to be set in higher. Those are all true for a section of population who does not have to worry about where the money is going to come in 3 months down the line, right?
Right.
That's not India in the main sense. We just had our general elections sort of decided a fairly surprising results for everyone that got released yesterday, and with the opposition sort of doing well. And if you actually read what they advertise, forget what's on their manifesto. If you read what they advertise, you would see that they would advertise things which, by the way, economically a little bit disturbing, but still notice what they're promising: 10 lakh government jobs. It's a very clear sort of a need for a poor country to get stable income. And obviously, like government jobs is not going to be the solution. That's beside the point. But the need of the hour for this country has been and will continue to be for many years a stable source of income. So when we started Kraftshala, we actually started with training some of the elite institution students. But as we expanded, we quickly figured out job is what people are looking for. Job is what you have to prepare for, and jobs is what you have to win for. Everything else is not really what the mainstream audience is looking for.
Can I dig deeper into a couple of the things that you said? First of all, 10 lakh jobs for people that are outside of India. What is 10 lakh to them?
1 million.
That's what I thought. Okay, so 1 million jobs, right? And understanding the stability of working in a government job. In a way, in Thailand, where I live, is very similar. You don't make a ton of money, but you never lose your job. It has high prestige associated with it. My mother works for the government, is something really proud for people to say. And that job is never going to go away. And it makes people also very patriotic. But the second thing you said was the GDP per capita in India as a whole is around 2,500 US dollars. But it's bifurcated at some level, isn't it? It's probably more trifurcated, to be fair, in the sense that in the bigger cities, Mumbai, Delhi, Kolkata, the GDP per capita has to be much higher, which means that on average, right, which means at the mean, not the mean, but like there's a whole host of people because India is so huge, so vast, that in second and third tier cities, it has to be much lower than it is in the cities. Is that true? And are there different strategies for different tiers of cities that Kraftshala is trying to approach as well?
Yeah, I mean, it's a large country and it has substantial inequality. So people sort of sometimes rail about the inequality in the US. I mean, compared to India, the US inequality is actually not that off. So to that extent, you would find some number of people at every straight up society,
Yep.
but the majority are in the middle. I mean, if I give you our own audience here, most of our students are what we call middle class students.
Mhm.
And middle class means that their average income is going to be, household income is going to be somewhere between $5,000 to $7,000 a year.
Are your students bypassing the existing and traditional higher education and just not attending at all and using Kraftshala as a way to say, I'm going to get the skills that I need for the current jobs that I know are available, and I'm just going to kill it in that little realm, and I can then go out and get a job? Is that true? And also the other thing is, in India, do you have to be accredited as an educational institution? So how does all that stuff work as well?
Sure. Most of our students have gotten a graduation from some accredited university in India,
Interesting.
and that hasn't done shit for their career. So that's the reality of it.
Okay.
People who graduate in India are some of the most disillusioned lot that you would find because
Wow.
they know jobs are not really coming in. And that's where, this demand for reservations, this demand for government jobs, it comes in because where else? I mean, you aren't really getting that many opportunities. And it's actually not, it doesn't, I mean, one would think that, okay, there are more opportunities in a Delhi or Mumbai. True, but not that much. So it's not as if, jobs have been flowing in. And it's very unusual because we also work with companies who are crying out for talent. So it's almost like there's a system, there's a big imbalance. People want jobs, companies want talent, but there isn't a matching which is happening in. And so most of our students are actually graduate, and in some cases, actually about 20% are postgraduates. So they would have done something like an MBA and
Oh,
still
wow.
not landed a job, or at least a job that you'd call a reasonable job. I mean, you get, let's say, basic data entry kind of jobs, which aren't really sort of asking to solve any problem. And that basically means that they come into our program as a way to land a job. We are an educational program, but they kind of, jobs is what they're really looking for. So to that extent, our programs, which are typically full-time in nature, so 10 a.m. starting, 8 p.m. ending, going up to about 4 months. These are intense programs, but they're really sort of, they're neither a replacement for what they are doing. So it's not a replacement for a master's, and neither are they jobs per se, right? They're just sort of a solution to a problem that is function of the ecosystem.
So, how do you know, or how does Kraftshala decide what to teach? It would seem to make sense to me that if the companies that are looking to hire have something in mind, they want to hire a person that does X, Y, and Z. And like you said, the people that graduate or have a master's degree somehow didn't get the skill or the learnings that they needed that was necessary. So there's that mismatch and misbalance that we talked about earlier. Do you go to the companies and say, like, what should we be teaching these guys and gals so that you would hire them? Or do you do research? Like, how do you figure that part out? And the second part of that is, does that mean that over time, the things that you teach will change as the needs for the companies change?
Sure. So before I answer that question, I want to answer the second part of what you asked me, which is what is the accreditation system in India? So there's an accreditation system,
Go for it.
and it is as broken as it is across the globe. And I'll sort of lay down on the most important way it is broken. It is that the incentives aren't aligned. So and this is true not for India, just for India, but everywhere else.
For sure.
Most educational institutions reward their faculty for publishing research in reputed journals. That might make sense, and there are arguments against it, but that might make sense in natural sciences. But I don't remember a single management, marketing, research paper of any relevance over the last, I don't know how much period. Maybe there's one, but that's about it in 30 years. So to that extent, most professors are actually not really concerned about making their students employable. And that's why the system continues to operate, because it's not as if there isn't money being poured into the education system. Actually, the money being poured in is quite substantial.
It's huge.
And a lot of universities are actually generating a lot of money as well. So it really huge industry, which is doing quite a poor job because of misaligned incentives, right? That's the reality of it. And that's why we have not really sought any accreditation, largely because we see it as of little value add. Our students want jobs, and our credibility comes from the jobs that we generate for our students. Now, to the question of how do we sort of stay connected, we run our own placement process. I think that's the reality of the situation, in that, students in India are basically learning largely through rote and are not really sort of comfortable with outreach, with problem solving.
Interesting.
They are not really doing these small jobs. So no student in India, even from, let's say, middle class, mediocre income backgrounds, have actually worked. They haven't sold a jug of syrup in a summer. They haven't done those kinds of things. If they haven't gone to a good educational institution, which most haven't, then they haven't done any interesting projects outside of their classroom as well. So they actually land up in jobs fairly clueless in terms of how they're supposed to be solving issues, right? So to that extent, and then they're exposed to a system which needs it, right? You want people to be able to solve problems from day one. So to that extent, the first thing we've done is we've basically owned the placement system ourselves. And we're like, look, these people are not going to be able to land high quality jobs on their own. Maybe they can land an internship which pays nothing and actually teaches nothing. But in terms of a job that actually does do both, it's not going to happen there. So we run our own placement system. That means we have relationships with hundreds of recruiters, going into 1,000 soon. And because we produce talent every month, we've kind of started engaging with them at a planning level. So to that extent, every time a new job description comes in, or conversely, the same job description comes in but has newer aspects to it, we're forced to evolve pretty
Got it.
quickly. So
Got
great
it.
example, programmatic advertising has been big large in the US for a few years. In India, it's been bubbling, bubbling, bubbling. We've been noticing it, but we haven't been teaching it. 6 months ago, we said, no, we have to teach a little bit about it. The batch we're going to be producing in June, we've just simply added 3 more weeks to our program, because now there are a lot of agencies who said, no, we want programmatic talent. So they were starting to hire people who even had superficial knowledge, which tells us that they would much prefer to hire somebody who has hands-on knowledge. So that's how the programs keep evolving pretty quickly.
How big is Kraftshala? It's not a physical school, it's online. Like, how does that work?
Yeah, so we are an online school. We last year we did about 800 odd students in the year. Ticket price is, I mean, in USD, I think it'll be about 1,400 USD, which is substantial. Like I said, household income of 5 to 7,000 USD. So these are programs that are substantial investment for our students. And we typically place 19 out of 20 students who are graduating. So, and to give you a comparison, schools of our kind, online or offline, would typically be doing about 20 to 30%. Of course, tech, because the number of jobs historically has been higher, they would have maybe good placement records. But in our field, which is marketing, sales, we're about 3 to 4 times better than what exists elsewhere.
I want to corroborate one of the things that you said earlier because it made me smile, where you said like there was, and again, getting back to this mismatch, right, where the teachers or professors at universities are not incentivized to teach. They're just incentivized to publish in what you call reputable
Journals.
Yeah, journals, right? I think we can put reputable to the side maybe in some cases. But I heard somebody say, I think it was actually last week, that Harvard, and I'm using Harvard as a proxy. Do you know how large, by the way, Harvard's endowment is? Just out of curiosity. You could say no.
A few $1 billion, I would imagine.
More than a few. It's $50 billion. I can't imagine why they even charge to go there, because they probably have enough money for whatever their curriculum is to send students there for the next 100 years. But I think the quote that I heard, and I think this will resonate with you, is that Harvard is just a hedge fund with classrooms. And that just made me laugh. Anyway, I want to get back to this thing of what you're teaching and how you teach it. So this fact that you do your own placements is a huge differentiator. No, in other words, even a school like Harvard, sure, they have on-campus events to get people hired, but they don't do what you're doing, which is proactively going out and building relationships at some level, right? And then doing the actual placement with the recruiters. It's a completely different model, right? In other words, you're literally building classes and courses for people that no matter how educated they are when they come into the school, when they leave, they have a skill that people want, because even you said earlier, they're hiring people with marginal knowledge in this space. So the extra knowledge then makes them hireable for a better job. Is that fair?
Absolutely fair. And as we're scaling, we're building a lot on top of this. So again, on the placement piece, we've built in, analytics that helping us place students faster, but are also teaching students how to think better. So for example, in marketing, we teach something called a consumer funnel, right? So awareness, consideration, trial, and we figure out where the consumer is dropping off. The same piece applies in placements as well. So, and we teach this to students and we give them data, and obviously we use it ourselves to help students better. So let's say a student goes into the placement process and doesn't get placed in 2 months. Well, these are young people, right? So imagine 23 years old and sort of going through that concern that, okay, my batchmates are getting placed and I'm not. So you have all of those emotions that you have to deal with. And as they have to deal with that, this kind of data helps enormously, because the conversations you have with them is, look, let's figure out where you're dropping off. Is it that your profile is not getting shortlisted? Is it that your profile is getting shortlisted, but you're actually not clearing what is called an assignment round, which a lot of companies have, or you're not clearing the aptitude test? Or is it that you're clearing those rounds, but your first round with an HR is not going well, maybe because you don't have the right energy and so on and so forth, or you don't do well in technical and so on and so forth. And you compare that with the rest of your batchmates, so you see where you're sort of lacking through. There is data that is coming in from companies. Sometimes that's a generic feedback, but sometimes it is also specific feedback that comes in. You map that to the mock interviews you would have done in the program, the recordings for which you'll be available. So you can correlate data from there. And it just makes the whole process much more specific, gives people the confidence that, okay, maybe 2 months I haven't gotten placed, but that's not necessarily, it's not going to happen with me. I have a specific plan to go forward with it. So we have really doubled down on that so that, 800 students is a very small number for us. We'd want to be doing in tens of thousands of students within a few years in India. And these kinds of data points are very important for them because the hope is people will really learn to solve these kinds of problems largely on their own with our support, just being training them at a more macro level. But today we can do it even at a one-on-one.
Have you raised money to build this out? A lot of this sounds like it's very sophisticated technology that you're building. Have you raised money to build this?
So we've raised very little money. We've raised about 150, 200. We raised it in two bits. I was trying to convert it into USD, but $200,000 is what we've raised, and largely from angels. And we've turned profitable, and we've built this technology sequentially. So for the first few years, we were basically sort of doing a lot of these operations manually to make sure we understand what we're building in.
Right.
And then we've sort of automated these pieces in more recent times.
Are there bigger companies out there than you? And if there are, like, how do you compete with somebody who's maybe more well-funded than you are?
I'd say that from a funding point of view, almost everybody is larger than us. And in many cases, they've used those funds to drive enrollments up in a shorter way, largely through pumping in monies. That's the fun part about teaching marketing, in that you can actually apply what you're teaching. And if what you're teaching makes sense, it should work.
Exactly.
Otherwise, you need to sort of change what you're teaching, which we have as well, in all honesty. Some things I learned at most of what I learned at Nestle was good, but some pieces I had to update. This doesn't work at all. I don't know what the heck I was teaching there. But one of the things that Nestle didn't teach me, but I learned it, as I was sort of building the first set of marketing programs, was to be able, let me just talk about two aspects here, actually, which are quite contributory. The first is this aspect of always sort of starting with a small market and then sort of growing it. I think that a lot of people, Peter Thiel, there's a lot of folks have spoken about first starting in a small market, winning in that, and then sequentially growing it there. So for example, we exist in marketing, but before that we used to exist in teaching marketing to a small subset of B school students. So we have looked at this business in concentric circles. First you win here, then you win here. Today we're the largest in terms of marketing placements. By next year, we should be the largest in terms of overall enrollments in marketing. So to that extent, we've sort of really gone about it in that fashion. And I think that is one way in which you're able to sort of dedicate resources and win on a particular metric fairly quickly. The other aspect is about using the advantages of your competitors and converting it into a disadvantage. So all large companies have superior advantages. I don't know who coined this, but I remember seeing it as presented as a jiu-jitsu move. And I liked it because that's what jiu-jitsu is based on. You use your enemy's strength against them, right? That's really the whole point.
Okay.
So the way you sort of apply this is you try and figure out what are the reasons why somebody is winning and see how you can convert it into a disadvantage. So for example, if you're a large brands are built on consistency, right? So if you're Dove, you're always going to be communicating real beauty, no matter what it is, right? So that makes them strong globally, but it also makes them weak in that they're not able to respond to trends in the same way that a upcoming company can. So that they're always going to talk in that fashion. The background is always going to be white. They're always going to show women or men, in this case, of a certain kind. And you can basically draw out a very clear contrast to it. And they can't follow you because consistency is bound to sort of hit them, right? So to that extent, you look at what is making your competitor successful and you start thinking about how that's a disadvantage, right? So, when we were small, there was actually another competitor who we felt was quite substantial. And this competitor really, they came from a family of running businesses, okay? So in India, we're still a fairly sort of a feudal society in that, what your family does, you also tend to do it. So business families are actually business families, right? So, and they're great at running businesses. I wish I knew a lot more about how they run businesses a few years ago. I would have not made tons of mistakes. But one of the things the folks they sort of operate at is they try and make each business profitable very, very quickly, which is a great idea. Except that sometimes when you're operating in newer territories, you don't quite know how to sort of solve a consumer issue. So if you put that benchmark that, I have to be supremely profitable, not, say 20% EBITDA, let's just put it like that. If you want 20% EBITDA in a new product, that's not easy to deliver, right? So that restricts the kind of innovation that you can do. So we knew that, right, in online, they're going to try and achieve 20% EBITDA, which basically means they're either going to price the shit out of a product, or they're going to deliver a product which is largely recorded videos and so on and so forth. So to that extent, then you use that, right? You know that they're not going to follow you in trying to sort of do something that materially impacts their EBITDA. So you get that leeway. Similarly, there is a yet larger company. Upgrad is one of the largest, in fact, might be the largest higher education company in India. Couple of close competitors, but they are certainly the most prominent. Companies of that kind, they're not going to run a model with 94% placement record, because they will look at this opportunity and say, look, we're not going to be able to place that many. This is not going to make sense.
But they still take the students anyway to make the money. Yeah.
They still take the students, right? Because they have to show valuation metrics every 6 months. So if you're raising, then you're forced into that game. So because we had not raised monies from institutions, we had that no pressure that, okay, in this quarter, we have to grow by this much.
Right.
So let's just enroll everybody else in there. So you try and sort of figure out what it is that your competitors are sort of not going to do because of the way they're set up, and then you sort of start to activate.
I want to ask you one more thing, and then I'll let you go. This has been really fascinating for me. Do you find it interesting? Remember, you said, I don't know if it was when you were a kid or maybe when you were a little bit older than that, you were like, yeah, I'm not going to be a teacher and I'm not going to be a doctor. And yet here you are trying to build like the largest education part, like ancillary part of the Indian education system in the world. Is it impacting you? Do you know what I mean? Like, I was never going to do that. Yeah. And here I am trying to build this big educational institution.
Yeah, I think it's the cycle of life, right? I mean, you have the Batman series, starts with Nolan's Batman series, right? Starts with our friend trying to master fear and ends with him having to embrace fear. So there is that cycle that exists everywhere else. As I've looked at my own sort of life, I think what I basically tried to run away is monotony. I think that for me, repetitiveness is what I was trying to escape. And education is not something that I thought I'd be doing. It's just something that sort of brought me back actually quite consistently. And, to the extent that in my final year, my engineering project was actually about trying to figure out what's messed up with India's school education system. And it was a project that, like, again, I don't know why I picked it, but it clearly has been top of mind for a long period of time. And I think that when you're running a startup, what you have to sort of square off is the fact that it's likely to fail. And that's why, it's not a great way to, if you're trying to earn money, probably startup is not the best way to go about it, but it's likely to fail. You might want to learn investing, or, there are many ways to sort of go about it. Right. Startups is where you lose money typically. So to that extent, you want to be doing things that are going to be okay with, even if you lose a little bit of money. Don't lose a lot, but if you lose a little bit of money, you should be okay doing. And I think that while I have respect for a lot of different companies, I always felt that if what you're building can meaningfully impact people, can meaningfully impact their lives, then that is a business worth doing, even if you fail. And in our own journey, we started with short form programs for people who were going to earn amazing salaries, not by India standards, but by global standards. That's where we started, the absolute elite B school students. And we kept pushing and pushing and pushing with the very clear idea that the only way this is going to make sense to us is if we are really impacting the people at the mainstream level. So I think that to that extent, I find this quite fulfilling, that the thing that I was running from is actually the thing that has consumed most of my life. And I sort of foresee doing it for the rest of my life as well.
So Varun Satia, the founder and CEO of Kraftshala, you feel so strongly about this. It's come through so clearly in this conversation. I really want to thank you for doing this. I'd love to have you back on in a bunch of months to see like what the progress is like, what's changed, what the new things you are that you're teaching. And I want to make one more point before I let you go. I liked how you said you were running away from monotony. If the Indian economy and frankly the global economy continues to be as dynamic as it is, then the things that you teach will continuously change. The things that people need to get hired for will continuously change, and it will definitely not be monotonous. Thank you again so much for doing this. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you very much for having me and enjoying this conversation. Thank you, Michael.